It's not my fault. That's the line that Jim Chalmers, Anthony Albanese, and the government are running with about the economy. Jim Chalmers has come out and blamed the RBA for the state of economic growth and the rather bad GDP figures that Australia has had for quite some time. Specifically, Jim Chalmers is quoted as saying, "With all this global uncertainty, on top of the impact of rate rises, which are smashing the economy, it would be no surprise at all if the national accounts on Wednesday show growth is soft and subdued." This has been reported by outlets ranging from the ABC through to the Australian. They're all reporting that Jim Chalmers is shifting the blame from himself and his own bad policies to the Reserve Bank of Australia. This is rather like blaming the firefighter for the fire, or more pointedly blaming the firefighter for the water damage that results when they try to put out the fire that you started. In essence, Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese have created a mess, and now they're blaming the RBA for fixing up that mess for them. And they're blaming the RBA for the collateral damage that results when they need to go out and repair the damage that has been done by the government. Now, this is rather telling, because Jim Chalmers has gone around trying to blame anyone other than the government for the mess the government itself has created. Whether it's the RBA, or whether it's Peter Dutton with his allegedly divisive and dangerous rhetoric. The irony, of course, is that when Jim Chalmers is blaming the coalition for being divisive and dangerous, he himself has been even more divisive. Just look at the Stage 3 backflip or the superannuation tax grab. Effectively, the government has tried to divide the electorate into thin little slices and pitting people against one another. They've tried to create minority groups that people can go and excoriate and then seize the assets of. Effectively, Jim Chalmers and the government are even more divisive than the opposition has ever been. In essence, they are divisive and dangerous, and therefore, according to Jim Chalmers, disqualifying. But in any case, back onto the economics. Jim Chalmers is stating that the RBA is smashing the economy. Now, to some extent, interest rates are, of course, resulting in some economic slowdown. However, that to some extent is a little bit the point, because these interest rate hikes are necessary to get on top of inflation. And therefore, we need to look at what is the root cause of inflation. You don't blame the interest rate hikes per se for the economy slowing. You blame the root cause that is forcing interest rates to be higher to get on top of inflation. And in this case, the root cause is the government. The RBA has specifically blamed the government for its spending, which leads to more inflation. That spending including reckless and massive spending on various government boondoggles that aren't really productive. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with spending money. The issue is spending money wisely. You need to spend the money in a manner that increases economic productivity, not just in a manner that buys you votes. Because that vote-buying spending doesn't increase productivity. It doesn't do anything to enable the economy. Rather, it just enables you to stay in government. In essence, it's what one would call an agency conflict. When you go out and hire someone to do a job for you, their objectives and goals might differ from those of yourself. So the government here, its objective is to get re-elected. And therefore, that might differ from what you would want the government to do. And as a result, the government has an incentive to go out and spend recklessly and then try to blame someone else when they need to go and clean up the mess. And with Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese, whenever they open their mouths, it appears to be misinformation. And either they don't understand the economy or they are lying when they talk about the economy. Take your pick, because neither of them is good. And we can just look at a couple of these. Firstly, for example, we've got the Stage 3 tax backflip. This was a clear broken promise. Labor promised to enact the Stage 3 tax cuts in full. Then they reneged on that promise by halving the Stage 3 tax cuts. That is a clear broken promise, even though they assert that it is not. It was misinformation when they said they were going to enact the Stage 3 tax cuts in full. Secondly, the government promised to not try to impose additional taxes on superannuation. But lo and behold, they've tried to bring in a tax on unrealized capital gains, in addition to an increase in the tax rate on superannuation. The government here lied. The government said they would not increase taxes on superannuation, and then they went out and they did it. They outright lied and they misled people. Then we've got the rhetoric from Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese about the energy subsidies. The government has come out and given a slight subsidy for energy prices. They've claimed that that is getting inflation under control. They are lying, or they're incompetent, or both. The reason for this is they might have reduced energy prices with a one-off subsidy. What that does is it right now reduces energy prices. However, in 12 months' time, that's going to reverse. So that reduction in energy prices is inherently temporary because of how the government has designed it. You've got the subsidy that reduces prices now, and then the prices will go right back up when the subsidy ends. That is not a disinflationary or a deflationary move. It is simply a temporary measure. Not only that, and it gets worse, it does nothing to change the month-on-month or the quarter-on-quarter growth rate in energy prices. That is, it doesn't change the speed at which energy prices are growing. It is just a one-off decrease. Therefore, it does nothing to actually reduce inflation. In essence, it was cynical politicking. The government here making decisions purely for the purpose of getting re-elected. We're seeing this amped up to the extreme in Queensland, where Stephen Miles is going over the top with all of his boondoggles and spending that are clearly going to drive up more inflation and are clearly going to harm the economy, but are designed to try to get him re-elected in a cynical ploy. Queenslanders, however, appear to see through this, and they appear to see that they are just being bribed either with their own money as taxpayers or being bribed with someone else's money, and the buck has to stop eventually because there's only so much money that is left. And once you start running out of money, you need to borrow money, and then you, the taxpayer, need to pay the interest on the debt that you need to take out. I.e., people can see that Stephen Miles, when he's doing all of these subsidies and expenditure, that money is simply just being rinsed from one taxpayer back to that taxpayer themselves, or from one taxpayer to someone else. People can see that, and when it gets to such extreme measures, it becomes obvious to everyone. And so it is with the government. It is obvious to everyone right now what the government is trying to do. The government has not improved the situation with inflation, and they're now trying to blame someone else for what is going wrong. Now, turning to the economic growth figures, well, at the time of recording, we're just before another GDP release. However, Australia has been in a per capita recession. That is, the amount of economic output, or GDP, per person has been decreasing. And while GDP overall has been increasing, it's been increasing at an anemic rate. And at the time of recording, the forecast for the next quarter-on-quarter growth is about 0.2 percentage points, taking annual growth to 0.9% growth in GDP, which is terrible, because one wants GDP growth around the 2 to 3% at least. So here, the GDP growth is slowing, and GDP per capita is in negative territory. There is a per capita recession, and there is no papering over this. The only way the government has tried to resolve it has simply fallen in on itself, because the government has tried to resolve that decrease in GDP per person by increasing the number of people. That is, if GDP per person is decreased, well, now you increase the number of people to just ramp up the total amount of GDP. i.e., GDP per person multiplied by the number of people equals your overall GDP in very simplistic terms. Increase the number of people, then you increase your GDP. That, in essence, is their calculus. Now, of course, people aren't necessarily confident that Peter Dutton would do a better job, but they certainly think that Anthony Albanese is terrible. For example, the News Poll survey asked, if Peter Dutton and the coalition were in government instead of Anthony Albanese and Labour, do you think A, inflation would be higher than it is now? B, inflation would be the same as it is now? C, inflation would be lower than it is now? Or D, don't know. Now, if we look at this across all people, regardless of their political persuasion, 18% of people think that Peter Dutton would have higher inflation. Not quite sure how that's coming about. 41% of people think that inflation would be about the same. What that would appear to imply is that either Peter Dutton's policies would be similar to those of Labour, or alternatively, inflation is driven by overseas factors and beyond the control of the government. I'm not necessarily convinced that that group of people is per se correct, in that I suspect that Peter Dutton would have a different policy set from Labour, and as we are seeing with overseas markets, inflation has been cooling in the United States, in the UK, and in Europe, so it's not entirely clear that inflation is entirely overseas either. And in terms of inflation being lower, well, 24% of people think it would be lower under Peter Dutton than under Labour. And then, of course, D, 17% of people say that they don't know, which is a fair enough position to take if you're not entirely convinced by either party. Now, of course, there are unsurprising splits across party lines. For example, 50% of coalition voters think inflation would be lower under Peter Dutton, but only 4% of Labour voters and 3% of Greens voters think that it would be. Furthermore, if we're looking at primary votes, well, the primary vote for the coalition hasn't exactly gotten very much better in the latest news poll either. For example, the primary vote for the coalition actually ticked down 1 percentage point, and the primary vote for the One Nation actually increased 1 point. However, The one nation is unlikely to form government, and we're really looking at the two-party preferred as the one we need to be looking at. And here it appears to be neck and neck, with both the Coalition and Labour at 50-50. Exactly how this turns out at the come election time isn't totally clear, but my gut feeling is it will likely be a Labour minority government, because while the two-party preferred has them at 50-50, the primary vote has Coalition ahead. We need to think about exactly how those votes are going to fall in the House of Representatives. And here, the party that may get some more votes are either the Greens or the Teal Independents. Now, the Teal Independents, they would largely take seats away from the Coalition. It's not entirely clear who they would support for government, but my gut feeling is they would probably actually support Labour over the Coalition. The Greens would certainly support Labour over the Coalition, and we've got Di Lee as an independent who also would seemingly be more inclined to support Labour, although she has disagreed with them on quite a number of policy positions. In essence, therefore, it seems a Labour minority government is the most likely outcome based on both the two-party preferred and the primary votes that we are seeing. But regardless, on the economy, Labour has clearly messed up. Jim Chalmers is out of his depth. He's obfuscating and he's deflecting and he's blaming anyone else for his own mess up. And Anthony Albanese is doing the same. They are divisive, they are dangerous, and therefore they are disqualifying, according to Jim Chalmers' own assessment of such things. They are, in essence, hypocrites. But let me know your thoughts about them in the comments below.